Hello, community, and welcome. I'm Dr. Anita, founder and CEO of Dr. Anita Enterprises, where I help leaders and teams navigate complexity and change by raising awareness about how diversity, inclusion, and belonging reinforces workforce sustainability. I've just finished a short hiatus from my Keeping It Real podcast, and today I'm presenting a new twist called Real Conversations from the C-Suite. The purpose is to invite members of the C-Suite to share their views on the importance of diversity and inclusion and belonging from their unique perspective. Today, I'm excited to have Mr. Leo Botteri, founder of Peer Innovation, a peer advisory group focused on the leadership experiences of the C-Suite community. Leo, thank you so much for joining me today. And to give us some insight into the C-Suite experience, tell us about your background, how Peer Innovation came to be.
All right. Well, I'll try to be quick with this, be at least succinct about it. But, I probably spent about 25 years or so in corporate communications on the agency and client sides of the business. And one of the last positions I had like that was I headed up corporate communications for Vistage. And Vistage assembles and facilitates peer advisory groups for CEOs and business leaders all over the world. And while I was there, and we chatted about this a little beforehand, I was leading a brand refresh for the company. And during that time, I would ask CEOs, right? Like, how do you learn? How do you grow? How do you bring new thinking into your companies? And they'd tell me things like, well, I read books, I have a coach, I hire consultants, I go to events and conferences. Some would even say they went to executive development programs, places like Harvard and Stanford, but nobody, and I mean zero, in an unassisted way, would offer that a peer advisory group was even in their consideration set. It wasn't a resource they were even thinking about. So as I was reporting out on the rollout to the board of directors, I basically kind of shared the story with them and said, Vistage has been at this since 1957. And I said, us and everyone else in this space is trying to sell a Mercedes to someone who doesn't even know what a car is. So the idea was to really create a narrative around this space, to really talk about what these groups are and how and why they're so incredibly effective for CEOs and business leaders around the world. So in an effort that was co-authored with the CEO of Vistage at the time, Leon Shapiro, he and I had the Power of Peers published in March of 2016. And it was a great experience, but it was also something that I recognized quickly was really just the beginning, right? So from that, I've developed 2 books since, and also I think, very powerful self-assessment workshop that I use for both very experienced peer advisory groups as well as brand new ones, not so much as an assessment, but as an aspirational exercise. But I think what's most important in so many respects is that we can take what these workshops do, which are about having very intentional conversations using a 5-factor framework that helps these peer groups really perform at their highest level. And as you might imagine, the same framework is absolutely just as powerful for high-performing teams. Mm-hmm. So I do work today with both peer groups and high-performing teams, just really helping them be their best selves as they want for themselves, right? It isn't me telling them what they should do, what they shouldn't do, or anything like that. It's about them just being really clear on what they want and look at how they can help each other get there. So it's been great fun. So it's fun work, and I love it.
I love the idea of your 5-factor framework. Say that again. I don't want to get that wrong.
Yeah. So part of what happened, and I'll go through this briefly again too. So in our findings, when we were looking at high-performing peer groups, and you might ask, well, what is a high-performing peer group? What does that even mean? What does that look like? But when we were, talking with different organizations around the world, we had them identify what their high-performing peer groups were. And in many cases, they used things like Net Promoter Score, or they looked at the compound annual growth rate around members over a period of time. They might just look at member survey information and where they ranked their experiences incredibly high. But no matter how they did it or what group we looked at, we found a couple of things. One is they had what we called a robust learning achieving cycle. And basically, that simply means that we learn better when we learn together, when we share with one another. Josh Bersin did a study in 2019 where he talked about the fact that if we were to take a 1,000-word magazine article and read it one time, we'd likely remember about 28% of it for 24 to 48 hours. Then it would plummet right after that. If we read it a second time, the number goes to 46%. If we share that information with others, we grapple with the concepts and we, share experiences and ideas and all of that. Now that number climbs to 69%. But the interesting part about groups like this is they don't come together just so they can help each other understand concepts more deeply. They help each other by giving one another the courage and the confidence and the encouragement to apply things that they've learned. And once they do, even if there's some trial and error, they achieve some great things. They celebrate those wins. And then we start that wonderful cycle of really about learning and growing. But one of the things that became evident is that that's great, but that doesn't happen by just putting a bunch of people in a room and hoping for the best. So this is where the 5-factor framework, where it was necessary to have the right people in the room, that they enjoyed a level of psychological safety, and not only the environment was psychologically safe, but the individuals actually leveraged it and took advantage of it, that they were productive. They used their time really well together. They were able to leverage all the intellectual and emotional capital, in that room and do so really effectively. Fourth was really having a culture of accountability, but not one that was about people coming in and feeling like they had to play defense, right? But they were just there knowing that they had the level of support and challenge in around that room that would help them just achieve what they've already expressed they want for themselves. So they were all in it together for one another. And 5 really is this idea of leadership where it was a servant leader, clearly, right? The leader who was there not for their own self-aggrandizement or to pad their resume, but because they deeply cared about the individuals and not others and helping them learn and grow and help their organizations do the same. And by the same token, those leaders also served as the stewards for the other 4 factors. They were constantly looking at, do we have the right people here exhibiting those right healthy behaviors? Do they enjoy that psychological safety? Are they productive? Do we have a healthy culture of accountability that doesn't feel onerous, but that people can enjoy and experience and benefit from themselves? So that's kind of what we do. And by having intentional conversations about those things and what that means to the people in the room, every group is different, every team is different. But interestingly enough, and this is, I think, where it goes to this whole idea of diversity, inclusion, and belonging, is that it matters both how we're the same, right? Having those shared values, having that shared understanding about what does it take to be a really great contributor to this group or team. But by the same token, you want a lot of different experiences around the room, a lot of life experiences. And that diversity, as we've talked about, prior to the program, can cut in many, many different ways. But the more of those perspectives we have in the room, the more the people are really open and willing to learn from one another. It's very, very powerful.
So I've been feverishly taking notes here. When you talk about your 5-factor framework, it reminds me of a model that I designed as part of my dissertation work. And it's just simply called a SHIFT model, but it's about self-assessing, honing in, investigating, fixing, and teaming. And the self-assessment can happen either through a formal tool or just sitting down and reflecting. Honing in is looking at what pops up from that self-assessment. Investigating it is looking at the deeper meanings. And fixing is not about fixing people. We're always so concerned that either something is being done to us or somebody wants to fix us. But in my work, I look at fixing our self-perception and our self-talk. For instance, there's a self-perception, I believe, that talking about diversity, inclusion, belonging needs to be difficult when it's actually just different. And when we align that with our self-talk that says, I'm not being coerced, I want to be curious, there's where the fix and the whole part of the shift cycle starts to really kick in. And there's teaming, working with others to try and figure out how do we create this shared experience together. So I love the idea of your 5-factor framework. And then, of course, you talk about leaders exhibiting courage and confidence. So my first question that I want to land on here is, especially when we're talking about the topic of diversity, inclusion, and belonging, how comfortable are leaders talking about that, specifically where if we're going to keep it real, this is keeping it real from the C-suite, right? If we're specifically talking about predominantly white leaders in their C-suite, how comfortable are they having these different conversations in terms of how concerned are they that they're going to be associated with shame and blame versus an opportunity to know and grow?
I think those leaders that have genuine curiosity are working toward being able to have those conversations more easily, to be more intentional, as we've talked about those conversations, and recognizing how important that they are. They aren't just things that should remain unspoken. They aren't those things that are just going to kind of happen magically and organically all the time. Sometimes we just have to sit down with one another and really, to your point, kind of keep it real. And when you can find yourself in a place, whether, and in my view too, the leader is always a part of the team, not apart from it. So they're all there together. They're all in it from one another, for one another. And if we think about kind of the triad of that, right, we've got the leader, we've got the individual member of a team, and we have the team itself, all with equal responsibility in many respects, or certainly a shared responsibility for whatever result we want to have in the middle. So that could be how productive we are, how much fun we have, how much real inclusion and belonging we're able to create among one another, because we know how essential that is to, and how foundational it is to having any kind of psychological safety, which we know is so crucial in the workplace today. So are we there yet as far as, having those conversations freely and openly and, frequently enough? Probably not. But I think it's the more, I think, and maybe this is where, in many respects, COVID helped a little bit. COVID created a situation where I always thought one of the great ironies, and this is not every company, but certainly so many that I came across, where it took bringing the employees and taking them out of a central workplace to actually bring them closer together. And kind of what I mean by that is they would all be working from home. But as they're working from home, what do you have? You have like things in the background. You have kids and dogs and noise and stuff and life, right? And human things. And they started connecting with one another and really tapping into their shared humanity. And I think in many respects, that drove a level of people getting to know one another better, just being that little more understanding, that little more cooperative and less harsh with one another and all of that. And I think there were some barriers that were broke down there. And many leaders, by the way, who oftentimes would kind of sheepishly admit that, pre-COVID, they were always beginning meetings with like, okay, what do we got today? Are we done? Was this done, that done, this kind of thing? Now they open meetings by saying, how is everybody doing today? And they'll go around the room and, they will meet people where they are in a given moment and really get a sense of them as people first. And, I think in so many respects, the more that we can continue on that path of truly seeing ourselves not as, quote, just coworkers or, parts of a team that have a certain role all the time, but as true fellow human beings and connecting in that way, then I think we've got a real shot at advancing these conversations to a much greater degree.
I agree with you 100%. And I want to tie back to a couple of connections to some things that I heard you say when you talked about leaders. I believe firmly that leaders are the steward of culture. And when leaders get it, it's going to manifest and cascade down through the culture much more quickly. And then you mentioned diversity and how it cuts across different areas. My question for you is, again, we're talking about the C-suite. How much diversity is there really in the C-suite? And then when you talk about diversity, we understand that there's the importance of diversity of thought, diversity of approach, diversity of background. But if that diversity is still primarily reflected in non people of color, non-different types of how people present themselves, when you go back to talking about frequently and openly having these conversations, what are the hesitancies around that?
It's a great question. I'm not sure people are quite skilled yet at being able to build a diverse team. And I'm not sure I can articulate that even any much more deeply than that. It just seems that's kind of, what we're talking about. I will say that teams that have a great deal of diversity, and most of what I see is less racial diversity, certainly, but teams that have, for example, more women leaders, the men and the women in those teams will tell you that those teams are better because of that diversity. And I think the more that we can start embracing all of the diversity that can continue to make a team better and continue to make it learn and grow. And to, I oftentimes when I'll hear people in certain peer advisory groups, for example, and I counsel a number of different ones, and they'll say, we would love more women. We would love more African Americans. We would love more, whatever type of person they may be looking for. And I think they literally feel like they don't know where to find them. And that's
Mhm.
part of because they don't know where to look. And this is where we have to change where we're looking. We have to reach out to people and say, we want a lot more participation on our group or on our team or whatever that happens to be. Help us do that. And I think we need to, I'll just speak as white males need to be better about reaching out into communities where we are less familiar with, you know, who certain people may be or how to bring them into the fold, and we just need to be more proactive about that, because I think left to our own devices, we're going to look in the same places we always have and then wonder why we can't find the diversity we're looking for.
You are absolutely right. And I so appreciate your authenticity and your courage in honestly saying, um, there are no easy answers to this particular question. I really appreciate that, because too often when leaders don't know, they'll try and like give us something that makes them think that we know, and we know they don't know. It's so much
Right.
easier just to say, I don't have an easy answer to that. And that is a perfect place to pause and pick up next time, because I'm going to ask you a question that I always start my C-suite mastermind groups with. And I want to hear your perspective on that. Right now, though, I'd like to let our audience know that if you want to hear this particular recording again or any of my past broadcasts, please go to my website, www.dranita.com. And on the landing page, there's a button in the top center that says Keeping It Real Podcast. Please listen, like, subscribe, and let me know the topics of interest that are most important to you. Until next time, this is Dr. Anita reminding you to stay blessed and keep it real. All right, I'm definitely going to have Brian cut out that phone call. How is it that I'll make sure my guests have their phone off and I don't have my phone off? All right, so now
Makes
we're
me
going
want to check mine just to make sure. Yes, it's good.
Yeah,
Thank
right.
you.
Okay. So now we're going to go into the next question. And this is specific around a quote that I like to ask leaders about. So we'll go ahead and go into that.
Sure. I think it's fun. And what I love about this too, before we hit record, is just getting questions that I don't expect. It's fun, and so.
And you're
Like you
doing
said,
great. And
oh, good.
you're talking your talk because it's obviously coming from you. These are not canned answers that you're giving to me, and that's what I want. I want leaders to understand. I'm not looking for the canned answer. I'm looking for who you are, even if it's I don't know that yet. That's what this
exactly.
conversation
Oh
is
yeah.
supposed to be about. Yeah.